Considering how much of Jewish history has been plagued by anti-Semitism and the current rise of anti-Semitism, should we be wary of other people and their potential sinister intentions against us? And what should we do to protect ourselves? Can we even be dishonest in order to protect ourselves? Let's see what our forefather Yaakov did when he felt threatened by Esav and understand to what extent that applies to us, and is it an across the board or only when there is a credible threat. He said, Mishnah, in Masechet Avodah Zarah, we're going to start with the Mishnah in Masechet Avodah Zarah, which says, "As lo yisachet adam imohem mita nochri," that we're not supposed to be alone together with a non-Jewish person, although the term nochri is typically used to refer specifically to an idolater. Shedifnei zeh b'Mishnah, that's what was discussed previously in the Mishnah. That's how we know who we're talking about. And the reason is because we suspect that they are inclined to murder and it's not safe. So contemporary halacha says that applies in the old days when there was no real law and order, and murder was quite common, especially the murder of Jewish people. We live in a different society today where we do believe that in most, at least civilized countries, there is law and order and there is a criminal justice system, and you don't have to worry that the next guy is going to stab you just because you're Jewish. So the Gemara is mevorim for it in them. So the Gemara then expands what the Mishnah has told us and says, Yisrael, it gives various examples of interactions with non-Jewish people. For example, you're traveling and the next thing there's a non-Jewish person to your right. Again, specifically somebody who poses a threat, as we shall see. Keep the person to your right so you can defend yourself. And then it gives various other examples. But here we're going to come to the part that's relevant to us. And then is the Gemara Mamshich. The Gemara then continues as follows: if a person, non-Jewish person, asks you where are you headed on your journey, you should expand where it is that you're going. As Yaakov, our forefather, did when he was dealing with Esav, the wicked, bloodthirsty Esav. Because the pasuk tells us, we said, you know what, I'll meet up with you in Seir, which is Esav's headquarters. In the meantime, so the Torah tells us that he actually traveled to Sukkos, a different destination. Now the question is, what was Yaakov telling Esav? So Rashi is meforish the Gemara. Rashi explains that the Gemara is telling us that derech she'osa Yaakov meant azeot Esav and Gizok mipnei sakonos nefashos. So Rashi explains that the Gemara is telling us over here that the case of Yaakov was that Yaakov said because he felt that his life was threatened, so he told Esav azrach vos nigiven azoi, something that wasn't accurate. He told him, I'll meet up with you at Seir. But instead he went to a different destination, Sukkos, and he did not proceed all the way to Seir. So he deliberately misled Esav to protect himself. And we can extract from that a halacha that applies to us, that if somebody who is a non-Jewish person asks us where we're going, and you're concerned, then you give them misleading information about your destination. And the Gemara spells it out. If he's going to travel a distance of one parsa, then suggest that you're going 2 parsois. Because then he'll possibly put his ambush further down the road, and you'll take a detour and you'll avoid the trouble. That is the Gemara. So the Gemara says we should be wary and therefore take precautions. But the Medrash says no. Yaakov did not deliberately mislead Esav. Rather, the Medrash comments, look, he said he's going to meet him in Seir. Check the whole Tanakh. And Yaakov never got to Har Seir. So was Yaakov lying? That's impossible. Yaakov is the epitome of truth. Is it possible that Yaakov is the epitome of honesty and integrity? Should have done something deceiving. So it means eventually Yaakov will catch up with Esav at Har Seir. When is that going to be? In the time of Mashiach. The pasuk tells us that there will be the savior, so to speak, of Yaakov and his family who will come to meet Esav in the future, in the time of Mashiach. In other words, from that Medrash implies, as Yaakov had melchatchila gesagt was is in ganzen emes, that Yaakov did not mislead Esav. He actually stated a fact. Was der fragte Medrash, which is why the Medrash is saying, hang on a second, if he stated a fact and he was actually going to be doing X and Y, so how come he didn't do it? That's where the Medrash comes from. Okay, so B'Pashas Netman, as the Pirush from Medrash and the Pirush from Gemara Anal, Zainen the Deyas Chalukos. So at face value, it would appear that the approach of the Gemara and the approach of the Medrash are very different views, both about what Yaakov did and the lessons that we're supposed to learn from them. In other words, the Dasa Gemara The way the Gemara poses it, Yaakov felt threatened directly by Esav, and therefore, that's why Yaakov misled him by saying he was actually going to travel to Seir to protect himself. Even though he had no intention of doing so, he had to mislead Esav so Esav could not attack him. That's the Gemara's view. Whereas the Medrash is coming from the position that Yaakov does not feel an immediate threat from Esav, which is therefore that there's no reason why Yaakov should mislead him about his destination. And therefore we have to say he wasn't saying I'm going to Seir when he did not intend to get to Seir. Rather, he was saying I'm going to Seir, meaning eventually. So it would seem like they're two completely different opinions until you see Rashi. And when Rashi comments on our pasuk in Chumash, that pasuk that says that he's going to meet up with Esav in Seir, is Mechaber Pirush, and Rashi puts two of the two commentaries, the Gemara and the Medrash, together, which means they can't actually be dissenting opinions. This is what he says. He did exaggerate how far he was planning to travel, even though he only intended at that stage to get to Sukkos. And Omar, and his justification was, if he intends anything sinister towards me, he'll wait for me to get to Seir, and I won't get there. And immediately Rashi then puts in what the Medrash effectively said. So when will Yaakov get to Seir? In the time of Mashiach, which is the same pasuk that the Medrash quoted. That implies that the Gemara and the Medrash can harmonize. They can actually go hand in hand. They are not necessarily contradictory. Das says, even the explanation the Gemara gives, as Yaakov that Yaakov never intended to get to Seir. And the only reason he suggested to Esav he was going to Seir was to expand the distance that Esav would think he's traveling, as a Solomon to protect himself that Esav shouldn't hurt him. That fits with the fact that, and simultaneously, what Yaakov told him was factual. That he will eventually get to Seir just in the future, as in the time of Mashiach. So in that case, it's neat move on. That doesn't then make sense because Rashi learned Look at how Rashi is explaining his explanation of the pasuk. So here Rashi says that he is telling the truth. But yet Rashi himself says in his explanation on the Gemara, that the very fact that Yaakov gave a destination which was beyond where he planned to travel, by Yaakov teaches us, Rashi is the one who says that we could use that method to be able to mislead a non-Jewish person to protect ourselves if we feel that they're going to threaten us. So which one does Rashi believe? Does Rashi believe that Yaakov was being sincere, or does Rashi believe that Yaakov was being misleading? In Chumash, sounds like sincere. In Gemara, sounds like misleading. Which one is it? So the Mefarshim try to answer this by saying Mefarshim learn, yes, of course, we learn the practice that we should use from Yaakov is Yaakov is not like us. Yaakov is the person at the epitome of absolute truth. But the Medrash is Yaakov hamiti hoya, as the Medrash says, Yaakov is truthful. So Yaakov said something that Esav would have understood inaccurately. In other words, Esav would have understood it that he's going to Seir now. But from Yaakov's perspective, when he said, I'm going to Seir, that was true, eventually, in the time of Mashiach. Now, we're not necessarily at the caliber of Yaakov. Rashi is saying, you and I, we can actively mislead a non-Jewish person who we feel may be a threat to us by saying we're going somewhere where we're not going. That's the explanation the Mefarshim give. However, it's very difficult to fit that into the words that Rashi used. Because the Lashon Gemara is Rashi is commenting on the Gemara saying that we should behave in the misleading of a non-Jew who we feel is threatening to us, like Yaakov did. As a Yaakov by Kolodnim is the Zelba derech von Yaakov, that our so-called misleading the non-Jewish person is exactly what Yaakov did. So why? Why should we be, so to speak, lenient in this regard? Why shouldn't we be, so to speak, authentic? The clue to this lies in the fact that Rashi appears to include words in his Pirush that are not necessary to be there in his Pirush on Chumash. That expanded his destination. From the way Rashi says it, those words are apparently unnecessary. So we'll give a movin, when Rashi only said what follows, which is, don't worry, I'll meet you in Seir. And then explain, why did he say Seir? Because if he has sinister intentions against me, he'll wait for me till I get to Seir. In the meantime, and I don't actually plan to get there. Why does he have to put in those words? Im yarchiv lo haderech. Now those words are going to be absolutely key to us understanding what's going on over here. The bir in them, by using that expression that Yaakov was going to extend his destination. Rashi is clarifying for us, right at the outset, as Yaakov that when Yaakov told Esav that he's going to Seir, there was nothing untrue about that statement. All he was saying is, it's going to take me time. He's expanding the time frame of the journey, not the destination. The derech is given breiter. That's what is given breiter. That's what the word hirchiv means. It becomes a longer journey than what you, Esav, expect. And have a look, you'll see it borne out in the context. Yaakov had nicht gemeint zu verlängern dem derech. It's not that Yaakov was telling him a destination further than where he planned to go. As der Mokim Iluche is weiter, wie hat es gemeint. If that was Rashi's intention in explaining what Yaakov meant, Rashi would have said, Herich. He gave him a longer destination, a further destination than where he planned to go. He doesn't say that. Not the Arichas HaDerech is the Zelba, the distance is the same distance, Seir, it remains the destination. Not the Derech V'tzayim breiter, but the actual journey time is broader, meaning it's going to take more time. Yaakov says, I'm going to have to stop along the way. I'm going to have toilet breaks or whatever it is that the kids are going to need. As you see in the pasuk, this is belav hochi moving their phone. Was Yaakov had masbe given Esav, and as Yaakov clearly tells Esav, "Vani esna lo leiti." I'm going to travel slowly. The regel amalocha shelafanai because of all the assets that I have with me. The regel hayilodim, the regel hayilodim, and because of the pace of the children. Der Hilch wird sein Pamelech. I'm going to move slowly. Abstellen dich sich oft der regel amalocha hayilodim having to stop frequently. Until eventually I get to the destination. I'm not telling you a different destination to where I plan to get to. I'm explaining to you it's going to be a long schlep. You don't want to go at my pace. And therefore, what Rashi is telling us basically is, when Rashi concludes that eventually Yaakov will get to Har Seir in the time of Mashiach, not only is that not a contradiction to Hirchiv HaDerech, which we thought was a deliberate misleading of Esav, not only is it not contradictory, it's that concept that he's going to get there in the time of Mashiach that actually explains what Hirchiv HaDerech actually meant. That slow pace at which Yaakov will eventually reach the destination will be realized in the time of Mashiach. You'll say, but Rashi says clearly that Yaakov's intention was to go to Sukkot. That's true. But that is only true. It's nicht Kavanos as Yaakov had gemeint zu gehen bis Sukkot und nicht weiter. That doesn't mean that Yaakov was only intending to travel to Sukkot no further. Das doch hefach am first because as is dennoch gegangen in Shem v'chulei. Because the pasuk tells us he went to Sukkot and then he traveled further to Shem. So it'd be bizarre to suggest that he was saying, I'm only going till my intention is only to go to Sukkot. Well, we know that that's not the case. Now, the Itzdike Halicha, when Esav is gegangen Darke Seira, rather he is clarifying that this particular leg of the journey, while Esav at this time is going to Seir, is in the time frame that Esav is going to get all the way to Seir, Yaakov is only going to get to Sukkot. He's going to spend a lot of time in Sukkot, as the pasuk will tell us clearly. What Rashi will point out to us that he spends 18 months in Sukkot. So his blow is given it's one of the delays and the stops along the way, which is going to take many, many, many years until he eventually gets to Seir. Which now actually poses the question to Rashi's commentary on the Gemara. Favos lent Rashi befurusha the Shas as the Pirush from Yaakov HaDerech is. So how come in the Gemara does Rashi then say, well, Hirchiv HaDerech means that you should actually say a different length of or distance that you need to travel to where you actually intend to go. That is actually untrue. It's deliberately misleading. Of a baldas melenta safun kederech she'asa Yaakov, and the fact that the Gemara there, which Rashi is commenting on, learns that process from Yaakov's behavior with Esav, is different moving canal implies as what Yaakov did at that point. So Rashi on Chumash and Rashi on the Gemara seem to be giving us two very different messages. In the Gemara, he's saying Yaakov misled Esav, and so should we if we feel threatened. And in the Chumash, he's saying Yaakov intended always to get to Sarah just over a very long period of time, and we should learn a lesson from that, which we haven't yet unpacked. And Vizma says, Matam Nabir Anal, so how do you fit Rashi on the Gemara with the explanation we've just given? And before we understand and unpack what that is, let's have a look at the different language that Rashi uses when he's commenting on Chumash versus when he's commenting on the Gemara. When Rashi is explaining the Gemara about the fact that it's protocol, that you tell somebody who you feel is going to threaten you that you're traveling further than you intend to travel, Rashi says, so what does Rashi explain? Why are we doing this? Because I'm hoping that he'll lay his ambush in the second half of my journey, which I'll never get to, and therefore I'll be safe. Von dem Lashon is moving. That implies I know for sure he plans to ambush me. He plans to attack me. Said, therefore, by me telling him a distance further than where I intend to go, maybe that will be good enough to throw him off the scent and to protect myself. And if the Gemara says that we should do so because that's what Yaakov did, that implies that Yaakov actually felt directly threatened by Esav. Now, that's how Rashi explains it in the context of the Gemara. Look how he explains it in the context of the Chumash. Where Yaakov extends his journey, there Rashi says something very precise, which is almost the exact opposite. Omar, if I think he's going to threaten me, which is different to the Gemara. It says, I take it for granted he's going to threaten me. Yantin, maybe he's going to wait for me to get to him. Which means in the Chumash explanation, Rashi is taking it that the threat is potential threat, not a definite threat. He's not absolutely certain that Esav will do something bad to him. Now that's going to have practical application for us. If we are supposed to mislead a non-Jewish person who we feel is a threat, then if we're not sure if they're really a threat, are we permitted to mislead them because we're supposed to be honest people? Should we find another method to protect ourselves? So why is there this massive difference between how Rashi explains the Gemara and its version of Yaakov and Esav and how he explains Chumash? Well, the reason is because one is Gemara and one is Chumash. Is the we've explained multiple times that Saiba Firush ala Torah and Saiba Firush ala Shas is Hashem Meforish B'derech Hapshat. Rashi always explains, be it Gemara or Chumash, he always explains the simplest explanation, but the question is explanation of what? Now, when he's explaining the Torah, he's explaining the simple understanding of the verses in the Torah. And when he's explaining the Gemara, he's explaining the simplest understanding of what the Gemara is saying, which will be different to what Torah says. And sometimes what the Gemara is saying will not align with what the pshat of the pasuk is, but that's fine. Rashi's job he has to explain the Gemara. And that's relevant to our conversation because the Inyan Anal in Gemara is Behemshech. Where is the Gemara talking about how you deal with the person who potentially could threaten you and is asking where you're going? That's in context. In the sugya, in the context of a conversation about the fact that we don't trust the nations of the world because of our experiences of anti-Semitism. When a non-Jewish person asks where you're going, and we expect that he has malevolent intentions, so we expect that he's going to want to attack us, and therefore we have to protect ourselves. That is the positioning statement of the Gemara. And that's actually what the Gemara is highlighting about Yaakov versus Esav. It says, who was Yaakov dealing with at that particular point in time? Esav, who is a bad guy, he's a violent man. And therefore the fact that Yaakov misled Esav is given to Esav. That's because he's dealing with this villain called Esav. And as a villain, he's somebody who wants to harm Yaakov. There is history over here. That's the Gemara's positioning statement. But when you're reading the Chumash, you have a completely different view. There's nothing in the Psukim to illustrate that Esav intends to harm Yaakov. In fact, to the contrary, Adrabah. Let's start right at the beginning of this passage. Esav embraces and kisses Yaakov. And look at the whole conversation between Esav and Yaakov. He's speaking in an endearing, friendly, brotherly way. And particularly at this point where Yaakov is responding to Esav, where he says, then I'll meet up with you in Seir. What did Esav say just before that? Let's travel together, as Rashi says. I'll do you this favor of accompanying you. Things are looking very happy. It's just not mevrech shash. So if you still have a niggling worry in the back of your mind that maybe Esav has sinister intentions, it's only a niggle. You don't have evidence. And that niggle is because there's history of many years of Esav's hatred to Yaakov. So Yaakov takes a practical precaution and says, just in case he wants to harm me, I'm going to tell him a story that's not exactly what, that will take me a long time to get there. Und das ist der Chilek zwischen Pirshashi ala Torah und Pirshashi ala Shas. So because the Gemara and the Chumash are coming from two different perspectives, Rashi's commentary on the Gemara and commentary on the Chumash will be two different perspectives as well. If you look through the Gemara's lens, this is Esav. He's a rogue. And we then apply that to a criminal, non-Jewish person who is known to be a murderer. When that kind of a person starts to ask you about your travel plans, you know that they're planning to harm you. Therefore you're in immediate danger. And therefore you've got to pull out this technique, which is to mislead him by saying you're traveling to place X when you actually intend to travel to place Y. And the reason is to protect yourself, because there's an immediate, imminent danger. So if you intend to walk one parsa, you tell him you're traveling two. That way you can hopefully defer the danger. Because he's going to wait to ambush you further down the road and you'll get out of the way. That's the Gemara's perspective. But when I'm reading Chumash and I'm reading the story at face value, there is no clear evidence of harm. There's just the possibility that Esav still hasn't changed his spots. Maybe he'll still want to attack me. And if I'm just concerned that maybe he's going to harm me, then is Maspik the Amira ad asher avoy al adini seira, but if then he can just say, look, it's going to take me much longer to get to your destination. You go ahead and I'll catch you up, and that's fine. Now this is going to give us a phenomenal insight in the area of halacha, specifically with how the Rambam deals with this halacha of how you answer an non-Jew who wants to know your travel plans. So this is incredible halachic insight that Rashi gives us. Now that we see Rashi's perspective on what hirchiv means, that is effectively saying it's going to be a long oizgeschleppte Meise, as nit herich ongebende kamokim was is weiter with the ort wo man not bedert again. Not herich, that he's giving a location which is actually further than his intended location. No, it's marchen dem derech gufa, but rather just saying it's just going to be a very slow process. We can understand what the Rambam says in Hilchos Tzechah Shmiras Nefesh. This is how he says it. If the non-Jew asks you where you're going, you should expand the travel plans. As Yaakov did to Esav, Shenemar, as the pasuk said, Ad asher avoy al adini seira. Wait, I'll catch up to you in Seir. Isn't it moving? Something about this doesn't sit right. The Rambam is doch HaSefer von Halachas, as we well know. The Rambam is out there to tell us the clarity of Jewish law. HaSefer for the Halachas and klar aroiz gebracht kedei zu wissen wie ze tefrin sich befehle meise, which means that this is a book that's supposed to give us clear instructions so we know how to actually handle ourselves. If that's the case, why doesn't the Rambam explain what the Yarchiv Haderech means? He leaves it as an open-ended statement which we could misinterpret. So, for example, the commentators on the Gemara explain what Yarchiv HaDerech means. And the Beis Yosef Shulchan Aruch sagt it in Borur, and the Beis Yosef spells it out very clearly, that you should give a measure of effectively double the distance you intend to go. Why doesn't the Rambam do something similar? He is a book of halacha, which is supposed to be clear and usable. Now, you might try to force an answer, which is that Yachiv lo Haderech in the Rambam's view could be two things. Der Yachiv atzit sich nicht nur zum Dibur, was man darf sagen im Nochri, that Yachiv could, and firstly relates to what you're going to tell him, because he's waiting for an answer. Now, das meint euch, but it could also refer to how you're going to behave. Like, for example, Yaakov Avinu, when he sent the gifts to Esav, he intentionally created distance between the different groups of gifts that he sent him. So maybe what the Rambam is saying is, tell him one thing about where you're going, and then practically, when you set off on the derech, make sure to fall behind. Make sure that you're not where the guy is. And you could fit that very nicely into the Rambam's words. He says we should behave like Yaakov did with Esav, as like the pasuk says, which is interesting. You would have expected that if he's telling us behave like Yaakov, it should have said, as Yaakov said, let me catch up to you and say it. But it doesn't. It's as the pasuk says, which implies that it's not only what Yaakov said, but also what Yaakov did. So maybe that's what the Rambam wants us to know. Now, the truth is, that's a really difficult answer to accept because it's still unclear, and we had to work this out. So besides the fact that it's difficult to understand that that's what the Rambam meant, is der Inyan, as the principle that if we're traveling and there's a non-Jewish person along the way, we should keep our physical distance, if that non-Jewish person is suspected of being a murderer. That's something that the Rambam already tackled when he said, you shouldn't accompany them on a journey. Which then implies that when the Rambam says Yachiv Derech is the answer that you should give to the non-Jew who you're worried about, in response to his query, where are you headed? In that case, we're back to square one in our question. Why does the Rambam not explain what Yarchiv lo Yasaderech means? What words are you supposed to say? Now, before we can explain that, we're going to also look at one or two things in the nuances of the Rambam's language, particularly compared to the Gemara. In the Rambam, we're going to look at three things the Rambam said that are strange. First of all, the Rambam brings no the pasuk adashavoi ladini seira. The Rambam only quotes that pasuk that says, "I'll get to you and I'll catch up to you in Seir." Only dem zweiten pasuk was bringt sich in Gemara, and it doesn't bring the second pasuk, which the Gemara brings, which actually illustrates that he did not get to Seir, at least not at that point, which is the pasuk v'Yaakov nasa sukoisa. Surely that is critical to proving the point. Surely the only way that we know that when Yaakov said, "I'll meet you in Seir," he was actually expanding the journey is only from the fact that Yaakov did not go to Seir and went to Sukkot. And the Rambam is mashiv then pasuk, and the Rambam seems to leave out a critical piece of information that builds the case. Number 2 base. In Gemara Seloshin Kederech She Osa Yaakov. The Gemara uses the expression we should do as Yaakov did. And the Rambam is Meshan and Shaib Kederech She Hirchiv Yaakov. Whereas the Rambam says we should expand the journey like the Yaakov expanded the journey. Why that distinction? And very importantly, Gimel, in Gemara is Teloshin Yaakov Ovinu le'esav harasha. The Gemara gives context on who we're dealing with over here. Yaakov Ovinu is obviously a very trustworthy person that we should be following, and Esav is a Rasha who is a murderous person who we should be wary of, which surely is relevant to the conversation. And the Rambam leaves it out, and the Rambam is mashmik ditayarim and shaib Yaakov le'esav. He just simply says Yaakov and Esav without describing their personalities, which surely is a central part of this message. So knowing what Rashi explained about what Hirchiv lo Yasaderech means, it will help us settle the Rambam. With information we have, we can explain. As the Rambam held, as dos is the Pirish in Din Yarchiv lo Yasaderech by Yedin Eden, we could say that the Rambam's view is that Yarchiv lo Yasaderech, which is practical advice for us to deal with a person who we think might kill us, is that that you should extend the picture of the the journey that you're going to go on. That it's going to take very long, like Rashi pointed out. Till you get to the destination. That's going to dissuade the murderer from harming us. Because who knows how long it's going to take this schlepper of a year to catch up to me, and he's not necessarily even going to have the patience to wait around to ambush. That's the Rambam's point, pulling on Rashi's explanation. And that explains these nuances in the Rambam's language. He doesn't say as Yaakov did, but rather as Yaakov extended, as the pasuk says, that he told him he's going to meet him in Seir, because because that's exactly the point. That how did Yaakov throw Esav off the trail? By telling him, I'm going to get to you in Seir. But I'm going to get there. It's going to take time. As if at Gedern an unbestimmtes man, it's going to take an undefined amount of time. The regular Amlocha Yolodim, because of the whole caravan I'm traveling with, bis until he eventually gets there. Was von dem lernt man ab, as jeder darf sagen, but if an Azaz Marchiv sein dem Derech, that tells us that every single Jewish person has the same toolbox that we could use to say it's going to take us long. Was in dem is Archavas HaDerech is into dem pasuk Vayakev Nasa Sekoisa, and therefore, if the message is that you should say, "I'm sorry, but I travel slowly, and you don't want to wait around for me," then we don't need to know that Yaakov at that particular point happened to go to Sukkot. That's just a detail in the fact that he was saying it's going to be a long journey. Und der Rebbe is the Rambam mit der Yaakov Avinu le'Esav HaRasha, which also explains why the Rambam doesn't feel he has to highlight who the personalities are here, that Yaakov is Avinu and that Esav is Rasha. Why? But das Rambam is, as das, was Yaakov hat sich beworben durch Hirche von Esav, is nicht, weil es gewinnt sicher, als Esav HaRasha wird ihm ton ara. Because the Rambam's premise over here is that Yaakov Avinu is not absolutely convinced that Esav's definitely going to harm him. Warum Rabbi? Because, as we've already illustrated, right now Esav's actually behaving in a brotherly way. As we've explained. It's just that Yaakov is being pragmatic, and therefore he has to protect himself. So we're not going to emphasize the fact that Esav is a Rasha, because it's actually not relevant to what happened over there. But there is something that we have to understand. Because go back to the Gemara. The Gemara says, if a non-Jewish person who we worry might want to kill us asks us about our travel plans, we should throw them off the trail. Straight after that, the Gemara gives us two stories. Bring the Gemara zwei Meises von welches is Muchach, but the Meferash, as the Pirish von Yaakov is the Pirish Anal von Rashi al Hashas. Actually, both of these stories seem to be very clear that the concept of Yachiv Lo Haderech is dafka, to give a destination that's not the accurate destination. Let's have a look at how the Gemara says this. Gemara. The students of Rabbi Kiva were traveling to Chziv. They bumped into an armed robber, or armed robbers. So the armed robbers said to them, "Where are you going?" They said, "We're going to Akai, which is further than Chziv." When they got to Chziv, they went off their own way. So the armed robbers said to them, "Whose students are you?" They said, "We're students of Rabbi Akiva." You are happy and gifted to be the students of Rabbi Akiva, and as Rabbi Akiva himself is, you're protected from harm because you are clever in the strategy you take to protect yourself. In other words, that story is telling us what's the way to behave? Give a destination which is not your destination, and that's Hirchiv Lo Haderech. Second story. Rav Menashe Ozer Beit Turta. Rav Menashe was going on the way to this place called Beit Turta, Poga Beit Ganvei, and he also ran into a Ganav, and he said, "Where are you going?" And he told him, "I'm going to Pumbedisa." And then he gets off the road at Beit Turta, and the guy starts to curse him, and he says, "Who's your teacher?" And he says, "Rabbi Yehuda." And he says, "I curse Rabbi Yehuda." And Rav Menashe basically says to him, "Just be glad that Rabbi Yehuda didn't put you into Cherem, because you'd be harmed by that." On the Hemshach Gemara, the Hemshach is Rabbi Kiva, but the bottom line is that the story is the same kind of story, which is give a destination which is not the destination that you're planning to go to. So you would think that Bepashta is simply surely these are stories, and whenever you have stories of great rabbis, we know that this is how you're actually supposed to behave, that illustrate what the halach is. That when a person who you're worried about asks you about your travel plans, you tell them that you're going further than you intend. It actually works. It actually saves lives. Und dort haben sie doch gesagt, nicht emes. And those are stories where they misled these individuals about what their plans were. Also gehen wir machen von einer weiten Weg, weil sie sind gegangen, where they said they were going somewhere far, when actually they were going somewhere close. So can man doch nicht lernen, as Yachiv in Gemara is Kanal. Surely then, based on that, you can't expect that the Gemara is saying Yachiv means, as sagt ihm nicht liegen durch verlangern dem derech weiter wie wird gehen, that Yachiv doesn't actually mean misleading by saying you're going somewhere further than you intend to go. No, verbreitet blows themselves derech mit Shia Bisman, but rather say, I'm going to the same location, but over a longer period of time. That doesn't seem to fit in this Gemara. So the explanation is there's actually a distinction between Rashi's perspective and the Rambam's perspective, despite the fact that Rashi helped us understand the Rambam. Rashi and the Rambam are mechuluk in the Agdoras HaSakona faran Eden mitzadim nochri v'shol aleichan hoylech. Rashi and the Rambam have a different view of how serious the threat is if a non-Jewish person randomly asks you where you're going. We could look at it in two perspectives. Das is in selben geht es Sakona v'defridige dinim anal in Gemara. Either the Gemara listed a whole lot of dangerous situations, and this is one of them in the same category, or the Gemara listed a whole series of dangerous situations, but this one, where the person is asking you about travel plans, is in its own category. In other words, because at that time it was common to suspect that a non-Jewish person might want to kill you. So there are a whole lot of laws that Jews had to follow in order to protect themselves. And the Gemara lists them. Don't allow yourself to be secluded with them. If the next thing a non-Jewish person comes close to you while you're traveling, make sure he's on the right-hand side so you can defend yourself. If you're going up or downstairs, make sure that he is not above you. If there's a non-Jewish person around, don't bend over to pick something up because he might attack you. So Kemen Zogan, we could say this. Once we've established all of these laws, the next one that is stated, which is if he asks you where you're going, tell him a different destination, is in the same category. It's yet another example of where we have to protect ourselves. Because generally speaking, we're worried about how non-Jews treat Jews. Or there's another way to look at it. When a guy sticks his nose in your business, it doesn't happen to be walking next to you or climbing the stairs. He asks you your business. That's a whole different story. This is a much more serious scenario than just a generalized fear that we have that maybe non-Jews like to harm us. The fact that he's getting involved in your business and asking about your travel plans, that is evidence to the fact that he wants to harm you. By asking you such pointed questions, this non-Jewish person has now moved out of the category of the world out there who hates us into an individual who is clearly plotting. And that's going to have a practical application in halacha, at least one, if not more. We'll look at one of the practical differences in halacha. When we go with contemporary halacha, which says we don't live in the Wild West anymore, we're in more civilized environments, and so the average non-Jewish person is not out to kill you. And there's law and order in our countries. So we don't generally apply a fear of attack on every single non-Jewish person. And that's why nowadays in practice we do have private meetings with non-Jewish people. We walk side by side, we travel with them, etc., because we don't have the same fear that used to exist in old times. But the question is, does that change when he asks you a pointed question about your itinerary? So if I go with the first opinion, which was there's a whole list of things that we're supposed to do to protect ourselves, one of which is don't tell your travel plans to a non-Jewish person. Well, nowadays we get along with the non-Jewish world. We're not even worried if they ask us our travel plans. And we don't have to mislead them with some kind of location which we don't intend to get to. But if I see that as a category within its own, that the minute a non-Jewish person who you don't know wants to understand your travel plans, then it's no longer suspicion, it's absolutely clear that he has malevolent intention, then that applies equally today. Somebody wants to know personal details about us, about our communities, we need to be on guard. And that is the point of difference in the perspectives of Rashi and Rambam. Rashi, when commenting on the Gemara, where this discussion happens, takes the second view, which is the minute an individual non-Jew asks you about your travel plans, they put themselves into a unique category. And he obviously wants to cause harm. Protect yourself. And Rashi extracts that out of the way the Gemara positions this law. Because what did the Gemara do? It told us this halacha and straight away went into these two stories that show you imminent threat. Wegen Pogabay Listim und wegen Pogabay Ganvei, stories of armed robbers and thieves. The Mittelend the Gemara das Rashi as by Chelek and Hoylech. So therefore, Rashi's interpretation of the Gemara is that the minute the guy asks you about your itinerary, after knocking them together from Mazik Vadai, he is an absolute threat. But Dugmas Listim and Ganvei, he's like an armed robber or a ganef, and you have to protect himself. The Rebbe learned Rashi. As done by therefore Rashi says, in those circumstances, do whatever it takes to protect yourself. Don't only give him misleading words that hopefully he'll stop thinking about his plan. But you've got to be really clear. Don't just say, it's going to take me long to get there. You've got to be really clear that you're misleading him. Specifically say a distance further than you intend to go, in the hope that you're hoping that it's going to take long until you reach that destination. He's going to be waiting for you at that destination. You never intend to get there. And that would fit into the principle of seeing Esav as a Rasha and therefore seeing Yaakov as misleading him to protect himself. And that's then borne out in the two stories told in the Gemara. They were in clear and present danger, and it helped them to follow this advice, therefore it's real. That's Rashi's view. The Rambam takes a broader view. In Gemara, the very fact that there's a list of things that we're supposed to do to protect ourselves from harm, one of them being don't tell the non-Jewish guy your travel plans, and therefore there's just one category of laws to protect ourselves. And even if the person is asking you about your personal business, where you're traveling, that does not mean, says the Rambam, an imminent threat. Just one of the details of this broader concept that the non-Jewish world wants to kill us. And the Rambam as the is therefore the Rambam's view is, how do you deal with this? That the way you deal with this is, tell him it's going to take me long to get there. Don't mislead him, just say the truth. I'm not going to travel so fast because that's my plan. So broaden the time span of the journey that you're going on. Don't spell out where you're headed right now. Not infant. As I'll say, listen, I have a long way to go, got various detours along the way, I'll get there. It's going to take me time, I'm going to be delayed on the way until eventually I reach my destination. Then if I am worried that there is potentially any danger, this should mitigate that danger. And that would fit into the pshat of the story, where at that particular moment there was no direct threat from Esav to Yaakov. To the contrary, as we already explained, they're actually on good terms at this particular point in time. So Rashi, on the Gemara at least, is coming from the perspective that if a person asks those kind of questions, imminent threat, take all precautions. Rambam's coming from the perspective that we actually are not so worried about the non-Jewish world, so you might want to take some precautions, but you don't have to start suspecting that there's a murderer behind every rock. Now, you'd ask the Rambam, but what about the Gemara? The Gemara brought us examples. It told stories of how you're supposed to behave in this way. What do you do with that? Says the Rabbi, that's another whole area of halachas, another law. Oy bari hezeka. That means if you know that there's an absolute threat, v'balistim oder ganve, like in those stories where the guys were armed to the teeth. Then we're going to say, well, you don't behave like an ordinary person asking your travel plans. That's when you really have to protect yourself by misleading him with a destination that is not your destination. And then you hope that the guy's going to lay an ambush further down the road. In the meantime, he'll get away from you, you'll get away from him, and you'll be safe. Now, this is a profound lesson for us in terms of how we view ourselves in the context of living as a citizen of this world amongst nations of the world. Where's our head? Do we live here, or do we live in a Mashiach headspace? It makes sense that any time in Torah that you learn one concept from another, is the bir bazeh as in amelamed is the sibe was funem vet masube v'nimshach das was es kommt zu in dem davar nilmad. So it makes perfect sense then that what happens is if I'm learning A from B, that means that whatever is in B, the source that I'm learning from, influences the reality of A. But let's put that into our circumstances over here. The concept that we have a method that we could use that actually works to protect ourselves from a non-Jewish person who has evil intentions against us. How do we have that capacity to save ourselves? Because deep within ourselves is the detour that Yaakov made for Esav. If we know how to grasp that detour, we know how to protect ourselves from evil intentions. What does that mean? It means this. The capacity for a non-Jewish person or non-Jewish thinking to overcome a Jewish person is das beschaßte Eid 40 in Anofen, as sein Ort is in Gottes bei dem Goy. That's as long as the Jewish person is living in a headspace that I actually live in the jurisdiction of the non-Jewish world. Und der Rebbe meint der Goy as der Eid is bemis unter sein Schlitter. So therefore the perception of the Goy is, well, you're living in my world, so I'm in control, and therefore I can harm you, chas v'sholem. But if a Jew in their mind is already thinking about something much further down the line, he says, listen, I have delays along the way, but those delays are not where I live. I'm on a journey to meet you in Seir, which is in the time of Mashiach. I'm on a journey to Mashiach. That's where my head is. When Mashiach comes, it's going to be a completely different world to what it is now. You're not going to have the upper hand. The Eibush is going to have the upper hand. And the Jewish world's going to have the upper hand. Is the hachona, the derech ungein zu die Geula. Wherever I am along my journey right now in Golus, that's just prep work. That's just getting me to my destination, which is Mashiach. But where do I really live? There, in the time of Mashiach. You know why I'm on this journey? Because I'm trying to refine and elevate the world. I'm trying to break through the overwhelming darkness of this world with the light of Torah and mitzvahs. I'm preparing the world for that future redemption. When the Eibishter will illuminate the world, and the nations will follow that light. And where the Eibishter will be completely revealed for everybody in the most physical way. So if I'm living in a headspace that all of this is just getting me to the point of Geula, then the stranglehold of the Goyish world falls away. They can't control me anymore. And then I live with peace of mind. As long as I'm on the path of Geula, or going to Geula, even though we haven't even begun the process of Geula yet, my journey will be like Yaakov's, where he gets to Shem whole. He's not harmed physically, he's not harmed financially, he's not harmed spiritually, his Torah is intact. That means if we live, that we're preparing and on a road to Mashiach, and this world is just a temporary bystop along the way, then we'll also be good. We'll be healthy. We'll have all the brachas that we need. But Teirasam will be spiritually fine. We'll learn Torah b'menucha, we'll be able to learn Torah with peace of mind. And I know from Shalom b'Torah in a way that our Torah is complete and whole. The Torah is gans. We learn Sai Nigle the Torah, Sai Pnimius Torah. Whole means that we learn both the revealed and the hidden parts of Torah. Shebeterein niskalta b'Torah Chassidus, which nowadays is through Chassidus. When I know from Torah Achas and Torah Tamima, and we learn them not as two different disciplines, but as a single harmonious Torah. And dos is Mamarbis Mashiach Tzidkenu. That speeds up the coming of Mashiach. When as Perek Beis, the Avoila Denisa Ira, or as we saw earlier, that's what's going to happen when Mashiach comes. That's when we're going to get to Seir. And that's the time we will be able to settle our differences with Esav and bring Esav on board to be able to recognize that Dabish is in control, and that should happen immediately.